Hi, I'm Jim Alkove, the co-founder and CEO of Oleria. Thank you so much for joining us on the Oleria Security Leaders Exchange. Today, I'm joined by Carey Frey, the Chief Security Officer of Telus. Thank you for joining us, Carey.
Thank you, Jim. It's my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, I'm super excited because we're going to talk about my favorite topic, identity, and the work that we partnered on for the Signet guide on managing identity in the age of AI. But before we get started, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and you sort of how this problem has been with you on your journey.
Sure. So my background is pretty simple. I am the CSO at Telus. I've been in this job for close to 10 years. And prior to that, I spent 20 years at the Communications Security Establishment, which is Canada's cryptologic agency counterpart to the NSA in the United States. And my very first job at the Communications Security Establishment was migrating our workforce identity basically from a homegrown system in a mainframe kind of early Unix server environment into one that was set up for the internet and Active Directory and that type of thing. So I became very enamored with identity and identity security challenges well over 25 years ago, and it's been a passion of mine ever since.
Awesome. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversations on identity to date, and I'm excited for this one too. About a little over a year ago, we were both in Jackson Hole, Wyoming at a Signet event, and there was a broader conversation on identity going on. I was leading a discussion amongst the group on the challenges we were all facing in identity, and I was sort of lamenting some of my experiences at CISO of the challenges, especially with the existing vendor ecosystem and architecture, and about the challenges of putting together an architecture there. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey and leading a large organization, a very complex organization, and the identity challenges that you saw that led you to want to be a part of this effort in the beginning.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think part of what's been great about the Signet community is really identifying and coming up with proactive solutions to security challenges well in advance. And I was part of a group that worked on FIDO2 many years ago. I wasn't, directly involved in the development of the protocol or implementing it into some of the large platforms, but a very early adopter of that technology and recognized that the authentication schemes that we had on the internet were not going to hold up to the threat actors and that, we were going to need more. I would say going back into the COVID pandemic, when we saw the huge transition to working from home, I personally thought this is a great opportunity for threat actors to think differently about how they're going to try and compromise us. And I think we did see not long after that a kind of a transformation in their communities and a pivoting to what we now call living off the land attacks. And by the time that you and I arrived at Jackson last summer, the data was showing that the tipping point had already occurred, that today's breach, the root cause is probably 8 times out of 10, it is identity. So we've moved away from malicious software and the exploitation of vulnerabilities and those other types of things. And the reason that we identified this problem is because in our community, we do have this shared view now that this is how we are vulnerable and this is where we need to up our game if we're going to secure our companies and protect our team member and customer information.
I think it's the intersections that our paths are incredible. Yeah, while I was leading commercial Windows and security for Windows 10, that was right during the time that FIDO and actually one of our other collaborators on this effort, Heather Atkins from Google. Google was very involved in the FIDO effort, the FIDO efforts there. At the time, Google had a lot of efforts around its own security keys, and all that came together to become the FIDO2, what is now WebAuthn effort in HTML, which was Microsoft was I'm a big proponent of, and Microsoft was a big platform implementer of. So I think that it just shows you that if leaders get together and really focus on building, bringing together a big solution and driving it through the industry, it can happen. Now, in the case of, passkeys, it took almost 8 years to get all the major platform providers on it and to get it deployed at scale. But if you think about changing an ecosystem the size that we changed, that's not that long, really. And so I'm hopeful that things like that make me hopeful that if we bring enough leaders together, we can make those kind of changes going forward. And one area where I think that we should consider that is artificial intelligence. And I wanted to sort of pick your brain a little here at the beginning. You know, when we make these big technology changes like the one to the internet, you know, we often forget that security is a really important part of that journey, and we sort of have to put it in as an after fact. For example, like, you know, the original internet protocols really didn't think about security, and then, you know, SSL through also one of our good colleagues, Tahir El Gamal, you know, sort of became a capability to sort of add security after the fact. So when we think about AI, I think we're dangerously close to that boundary right now of going too fast with the technology to really secure it. And I wondered sort of how you're thinking about it, especially as it relates to AI and identity.
Yeah, no, it's true. The moment is now, and AI agents are here. And I think what I've observed over my career is whenever there's a need to create an identity for something, a human, a non-human, whatever it is, we turn to our systems and say, well, okay, they maybe weren't designed with this use case in mind. So how do we sort of hack it or like force fit it in? And I think what we've talked about is that that's already started to happen in the agentic AI era. And when we decompose the systems that we have for identity in the enterprise, they were not built with these use cases in mind. And so we could potentially do some very dangerous things going forward, which could give threat actors a heyday later on after there's a lot of adoption of this if we don't change some of our practices now and try and make it a little bit more secure by design before we really scale up this new and profound transformative technology.
I completely agree. And I think that we're already seeing some use cases around identity, for example, with co-pilots getting deployed where, you know, access over provisioned access and unintended access is pretty broad, pretty big problem that exists widely in the world. And there haven't been good solutions to take it on. So one of the things we're trying to do at Oleria. But now when you make that search really, really good, all of a sudden that data that was not findable but was accessible, all of a sudden becomes a breach. And we've, you know, I think we both had colleagues who've been impacted by that. And so it's definitely something that we need to get ahead of. I want to tease a little bit that there's definitely more coming from this group of collaborators to sort of help the world understand, you know, what we should do there. But kind of like FIDO, I think it's one of those places where AI is the place where we can lead with a security standard that's better, and maybe that's a good segue into one of I know we share a passion for the need to eliminate bearer tokens in the world, and you know, I think this might be is this a chance for us to sort of get the world to finally shift to proof tokens, at least for one use case, which is like the AI agents didn't exist before, so can just we make it so that all agents have to have proof tokens from the beginning?
It is fundamentally, I believe, what we need to do. And you know, big things start with little beginnings, and so I think this is very much going to be the start of a campaign to hopefully convince everybody of the threat that's going to be out there and why this is needed. And if I can step back from that a little bit, just to talk about our own experience and why this is such an important issue, we fully deployed YubiKeys or phishing resistant FIDO2 tokens across our entire enterprise. When I started using mine with our IDP, I went for a very long time without getting challenged on my authentication, despite the policies that we had put in, you know, to make sure I re-authenticated every few days. And I went to my team and said, I don't understand what is happening here. And they didn't understand either. And you know, they had to really dig into the underlying protocols and behaviors of multiple different overlapping systems. And of course, what we discovered with the token that you get from an IDP, even when it's authenticated with a phishing resistant token, is that its time to live can be refreshed by many different applications out there, including ones that are outside of your trust domain in your enterprise. And so we would find that if I was logged into my VPN, I would never get rechallenged for authentication. And then I would be logged into SaaS apps that, you know, you could log in from a different device. And I said, you know, that's not how this is supposed to work, right? If someone steals this token, this virtual token, then they're going to be able to impersonate me, and not just impersonate me in one platform. They're going to be able to use my effective single sign-on to go across the entire internet to everywhere where I have these privileges. And so that really frightened me. And so, you know, overlapping that now to agentic AI, think about the prospect of an AI agent that all of a sudden gains that power, right? Combine a stolen or impersonated identity or a stolen bearer token with the power of agentic AI to just go ahead and do a bunch of things. And all of a sudden, you're giving an extremely powerful capability to threat actors who are not lacking for, extremely powerful capabilities. We don't need to hand them, something like being a child in a candy store. And so that is really why we need service providers, large enterprises, and all of us to lock this down a little bit so that there is more revalidation of the authentication, a little bit more fine-grained privileged access, and some more thinking about who is the actual identity behind this thing that is logging into my service. So, with that in mind, Jim, what are some practical steps that organizations can do right now to address that?
Well, look, I think there's two things that came up there. One, the standards to implement and the platform support for proof tokens have been around for a long time. I was implementing in my time at Xbox and Microsoft in 2013, and so it really is a matter of people taking the time to actually go off and change their services, whether it's an enterprise doing services that are built internally or using SaaS vendors out there or cloud vendors, moving over. I look at like the TLS wave where now there's TLS on every service on the internet, first order approximation. That wasn't the case for a while, and Cloudflare and Google did a good job of sort of pushing the world in that direction. I think we need a similar push there to get proof token adoption to happen. But you said something else that I think is a great point, and I think aligns with something else some people need to do, and is a good tie-in to the guide, which is that in order for you to really understand what's going on in your identity system, you actually need to be able to see what's going on in your identity system. And one of the challenges we CISOs have always had is there's so many systems, including different identity systems in the same organization, that we just don't have one sort of higher vantage point on which to look on the whole system and to control the entire system. And that, for me, was one of the reasons that I proposed that we all get together and actually work on this reference architecture that's in the guide. And so I think that getting a handle on all of your data, which is at the core of the architecture in the guide, which is this common data model, data layer on which all of these capabilities live in this unified identity access manager, which is this meta manager on top of the model in the model, is a big part of you being able as a CSO knowing what's going on, asking that question. You have the data to answer the question. So I think first start your journey to get to the work, read the guide, and then start to work on your journey to put those systems in place. And I know you collaborated. You were a huge part of the building of the guide, but also you were one of the folks who really took it in and actually took it for a test drive and actually had your teams engage with it. I'd love you to share with us sort of your experience of like hands-on, not just helping write the guide, but actually turning on it as a user and being a customer of the guide.
Well, first, I want to thank you for prompting me when you said to me and Jackson, I started this company, and then, I sort of asked the question, what's the framework that's out there, which is what good looks like for identity? And as we both realized, there isn't one. So I really love the idea that we took a stab at building one. And I think it really forced me in particular to go back and think about identity differently and more holistically, and to really make sure that we had everything in place. And in that thinking, certainly, I'll talk about the maturity model in a moment, but a couple of really key imperatives for us were that there's this question of what the source of truth is. And we now really have three of them. We have our team members or employees. We have what we would call non-contingent labor, contractors, third parties, and then we have non-human identities. So RPA bots, increasingly agentic AI agents. And they all come from different places, right? The team members come from our human resources department, and they have a system of record. The contractors typically from our procurement teams, and then these non-human identities from our IT and our development shops. And so our enterprise identity system really has to bring this all together. And the CISO wants to have the same NIST style thinking across that end-to-end process, everything from asset management and protective controls all the way through detection and response if there is an incident in the identity space. And so as we were developing the guide and developing the maturity model and thinking about what are these things that we need to think about holistically? A few themes really kept coming up over and over again. And number one, on asset management. I mean, I think in the NIST cybersecurity framework, everyone struggles with asset management in terms of what we need to protect, either IT systems or data. And it's the same thing in identity. And as we've been going through this, I think we've realized we have some really good inventories, on team members because it's linked to paying them. Are our asset inventories so good on non-human identities? No, not so much. So we really need to do some work there on the inventory. The second is there are legacy authentication protocols that many of us still have in our enterprises. And this has become especially acute for telecommunications companies in the wake of Salt Typhoon because encryption protocols that we took for granted, so PKI-based authentication technologies like TACACS and Kerberos, we now have learned have become vulnerable that if a threat actor can get onto your network through an impersonated identity and capture those credentials from the traffic in the network, they can easily take them offline, decrypt them, and then come back and log in as highly privileged legitimate users, which is very difficult to detect. And it results in a very short time for them to deploy ransomware in your environment or to obtain really covert places where they can conduct espionage. And then finally, in terms of thinking about detection and response, we were really confronted with that issue when the group that's now known as Scattered Spider started attacking us. And when we looked at what are our defensive capabilities that we can use, they attack systems where EDR does not reside. So CrowdStrike was not helpful to us because they were going around it in every way, form, and shape that they can. And so we sort of reverted back to collecting logs from our identity system, our IDP, our VPN, Active Directory, and building detection and engineering use cases to detect behaviors that looked anomalous, which could lead us to believe, is this someone who has socially engineered someone into giving up their credentials despite MFA, an impersonated actor or what have you? And we really need this now end to end across our identity ecosystem. So I really love the idea that your team came up with about having this data layer that resides across all of our identity stack, if we can call it that, which gives us that visibility into what's going on, not just for when someone has gotten into our environment, but so we can also understand the vulnerability of overprivileged accounts, stale accounts that shouldn't be there anymore, and everything else that creates vulnerability in our system.
Absolutely. This vision was ultimately what led me to come out of retirement to start Oleria, and I think I'm so excited that the group together, everybody rallied around that sort of as a common challenge that all of us had, and then also that we had a chance to ultimately even align on a set of core capabilities on top of that. And you mentioned a couple of them, like for example, identity master data management, which is not a topic that gets a lot of lip service in the identity community, but it is so important. I spend a lot of energy in my time as a CISO building systems to rationalize all the data sources that you were just describing. And ultimately, it's really a core identity problem that should be part of the capabilities of the identity system, which is why it's sort of a box in the architecture that we ultimately came up with, as a group. The same thing is true with, lifecycle management. The reality is lifecycle management has typically applied to single sign-on accounts, but realistically, all accounts should, whether they're human, non-human, whether they're local accounts or single sign-on accounts, should all properly be lifecycle managed. And so the idea that we sort of have these asymmetric sets of capabilities across the different aspects of capabilities and identity systems is one of the big challenges certainly I faced in my time as a CISO, and I know that that you've shared that you had similar views in that space.
I sure did, and let's not suggest that this is easy, right? There is a lot of work that has to be undertaken by enterprises in this space, and I think the value of the guide and the maturity model is you can identify where you are, and then you can start to build out on that journey. And so part of our learning and developing it and then applying it to ourselves was we realized, we're actually pretty mature in several different areas, especially the processes that, associate with Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, or areas where enterprises have had to be mature in identity and authentication in the past, but then also realized that we have work to do in terms of improving our authentication, and in particular, addressing the challenges that are to come with artificial intelligence and agents. And so the types of conversations that we've been having in our company relate to, what kind of identity is this agent going to use? Is it going to piggyback on the employee's identity so that, Carey is logging into things, but there's also this agentic Carey that is logging onto things on his behalf? And if there's a problem later on, the security incident response team is going to have to go, was that Carey, or was that the agentic agent on behalf of Carey? That's an okay model, as long as you have the telemetry that's in place to collect it. And so one of the requirements that I've given to our team working on MCP, working on agents, is to say, can you please ensure that we have the logging, not just in one single layer, but in every layer, so that we can map back if identities start to get proxied or tokens start to get reused. You've got many different places along the path to go and check so that you can do your forensics. And if we're introducing more, proof steps with the tokens and reinforcing authentication, if we're not sure it's coming in from a place that we trust, or we're not sure that there hasn't been an authentication that's been done in a while from a place that's got a really good sort of root of trust built around it, then we should force that, and hopefully, we will deter any threat actors who are taking advantage of getting into that sort of chain of custody in the identity. So I think there's a lot of easy things that we can do right off the bat. Of course, we're also asking global service providers and cloud companies, to do the harder work of building more of this functionality out, and, in raising the standards with respect to what is allowed by default, so that we can rely on that, and so that we know if something does go wrong, then we can access their APIs or get the log data that we're going to need to be able to work that out.
So there's a lot to cover here. I think you said it's not easy, and so if you think about, if you're the audience here of CISOs, like if you were to give them the top 2 or 3 things that you would ask them to start doing beyond go read the guide and start to get educated on this sort of architectural approach, what would your top 2 or 3 things that they should take action on right away be as it regards to identity in this new modern era?
Well, first, I will say that you'll find in the guide a list of 3 to 5 steps that you can take in 5 different categories of maturity. So that's a great place to start. The second one that I would look at right now is in this space related to agentic AI. And I would simply say, look at the difference between what the functionality is in an IDP, right? Your Okta or your Ping or your Entra or whatever it is that you're using, and think more holistically about the identity problem, because I think there's a lot of assumptions that identity management begins and ends with the functionality of those platforms. And we need to, like I talked about our HRIS systems at the beginning, realize that things start earlier in that life cycle, and then there's lots of data flows that get exported and passed through into other systems, and so we want to look at the whole thing holistically. The second thing I would do is, look at the data and the vulnerabilities that you discover. So I would find it hard to believe that no one is trying to compromise your IDP or your identity systems or socially engineer your help desk or what have you. So have a look at that threat actor space, see what they're doing, and go and harden the sort of lowest hanging fruit first, and then build a roadmap with the rest of your stakeholders to close the gaps on the capabilities that you may not have. And those are going to be the longer journeys. But I think those would be the 3 actions that I would summarize as the sort of, 30, 60, 90-day plan that a CISO can take right away.
No, I think that's great advice. For me, I would reiterate the one you said, which is I always tell folks the first step is to nail the basics, which is go after. You've talked throughout this talk about a number of things you've already done to nail the basics: deploying YubiKeys, strong, phish-resistant MFA, really getting a handle on the hygiene of your accounts, which requires visibility in order to understand not just the IDP-related accounts, but also all of those accounts and all of those systems they're connected to that you talked about. I've always felt like 80% is of the value can be done if you could just nail the basics. Then the other 80% of the work is getting the rest of the 20% of that, getting the rest of the 20% of the way there to great, which the guide really is trying to help people get. How do you get from here to there? When I was a CISO, I was a big fan of the NIST cybersecurity framework. I used it for my program, but I just didn't feel like two things. It was detailed enough for me for identity, and two, that there was enough of a North Star for what great in identity looked like. And I think the goal here is for all of us collectively to keep raising the bar, so there's always a North Star for everybody to seek in identity in terms of how great things can be.
I think we would be remiss too if we didn't say, look at the incidents that are happening now, which I think are like very hard to not know about, right? Sort of the fake North Korean IT worker scam, and even more recently, the SalesLoft compromise, this Salesforce drift incident. And, I think we need to add, there's a huge discussion going on about identity proofing in many enterprises, which all we mean by that is like, are you checking the driver's license or passport of the employee that you're about to hire? I guess I missed when our company stopped doing that, or didn't realize that they were never doing it at all. But it seems to me in recent weeks that the very common discussion at a CISO conference is, like, what kind of technology platform are you going to buy to, have someone do a selfie and like take a picture of their driver's license with their phone. So, if you're not doing that with whoever your recruitment or like, talent management people are, that's also a good one to check into, depending on how exposed you may be. And then going back to Salesforce Drift and SalesLoft, there's been a little information that has come out. There's going to be more that's come out soon, but the root cause was a threat actor got into the GitHub account of an employee at that company. That's something that we have had to work through in our company as well. So threat actors love getting into GitHub accounts because they're full of other secrets that we use: API keys, passwords, PKI certificates, all these other things. And so if you haven't had a sort of program or initiative to go and look at the way that the identity and access to GitHub is set up, and the permissions around the code repositories, and how provisioning works and deprovisioning works, and all that stuff, like, please go do that right away. In fact, maybe do that thing first before you read the guide, right? But I think those are two sort of timely call outs from the last few weeks that we've been living through in the major incident response space.
I agree. And the strong corollary is there that dealing with all those secrets in code is actually a part of your identity program. And so please go and clean up all those secrets in code as well. Like, that's something that we all should have been doing a very long time ago. Secret scanning technology still needs to improve. Call to action to all the software security vendors out there to help us get better at finding those secrets. But the reality is we all know they're still there in a lot of people's code, and we need to go eradicate them and put them in proper storage so that they're not there when the GitHub, when GitHub compromises happen, including insider threats. And so definitely, those are awesome call outs. Well, look, this has been an amazing conversation. I appreciate you sharing all of your wisdom of your experience. To go back to even the earliest days of your career when I didn't know the earlier, I learned something today myself in terms of what your early projects. And thank you for collaborating with me and the team on the identity guide from Signet. It was an amazing journey for me. And I look forward to continuing to expand it together. For those of you out there who are looking to access the guide, you can find it on www.oleria.com. At the top, there's a link that helps you get to the guide. And any last comments there, Carey?
I just want to thank you as well for your leadership in this space. You've got a tremendous amount of industry experience and wisdom from the many roles that you had. And, I doubt that there are many of us who can sort of get through our day without touching something that you are responsible for overseeing or making more secure or bringing into the world in the first place. So, I think we owe you a lot from the accomplishments in your career. And it's been a real pleasure to work with you to collaborate on this guide. And I think, the lesson for me is that our work didn't end with the publication of the guide. It is just beginning with the publication of the guide to get the message out there and to really work on making the case for, convincing everybody else in our industry why this is going to be so important, so that we can retain technological advantage, we can continue to innovate, we can continue to drive forward this great high technology world that we have reaped so many benefits in for from our society, right from the dawn of the first computer and the internet into the power and promise that the new generations of AI hold for us. And so this is going to be central to succeeding, and we ask everybody to become part of that journey with us.
Thank you again very much for joining us. Thank you for your collaboration. I want to thank all the other collaborators on the Sign and Identity Guide. There were a lot of leaders who contributed to this effort, and thank you to Heather and Robert Rodriguez of SignNet for providing a container for this effort in SignNet. I'm very grateful for the partnership. And thank you all for your time in watching this episode of the Security Leaders Exchange, and look forward to having you join us in the next one, where we'll have Sebastian Lang, the CSO of SAP, joining me for a conversation.